Connor Beaton, we focus so much on gender equity in the show, and particularly on the advancement of women. But increasingly, we're hearing that men are in decline. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is. I'm sure we'll get into some of the data and the statistics around it, but I think that makes sense. I think, I work predominantly with men from all over the world, and I think more and more men are struggling to find their place, their purpose, where they contribute, whether that's at home or at work. I think that the roles have dramatically changed within our culture and our society, and we've done a fairly poor job of having discourse or conversation around that. And I think it's also very important to talk about, because I've had this conversation a number of times, to really just preface, to talk about the decline of men, or to talk about how boys and men might be struggling, doesn't mean that we're not advocating for women. I think that that's still important, because what can often happen in these conversations is, as soon as we start to talk about boys or talk about men and what's happening with them, whether it's college and the workplace or education systems, what can often happen is that can be interpreted as we don't care about other people's perspectives or their experience, and that's not the case at all. So I think that those two things can coincide, and I actually think that that's arguably one of the most important things, is that both of those things need to coincide, right? We actually need to have the ability to have discourse about a few different areas. So one thing, just one example that maybe I'll give to sort of open this conversation is, there's a study recently that was showing that in 42% of American households, women are now the primary breadwinners, which is up from the 1960s. I think it was like 11 or 12%. And so this is a substantial increase, and it really goes to speak to the progress that has been made culturally. Now, the interesting thing about that is that as we've seen this increase, and as more women are, out earning or outpacing their male counterparts, their male partners, there's some interesting things that are starting to coincide with that. But I think the big thing that we're not talking about is the differentiation of roles. That men for a very long time occupied the territory of being the quote-unquote provider, being the breadwinner. And that was a large portion of a man's purpose within the family system and the family structure. And so when that's not there anymore, a lot of men will struggle to understand, what is my place? And I hear a lot of women saying the same things of, well, then why do I need a man? And so it's creating this bit of tension and confusion within, whether it's a family system or the reason to get married, right? We see marriage rates in decline pretty heavily. And so I think it's creating a little bit of contrast and conflict between men and women, where they're not really too sure anymore of, well, why would I enter into marriage? If I'm not doing it for religious reasons, if I'm not doing it for a sort of role, and if I'm not doing it for economic purposes, which, used to be part of the equation, I'm not saying that we should go back to that, but it used to be part of the equation. Well, then what purpose does marriage serve, and why should I actually go through with that? So you see a lot of people starting to question and opt out of even something as that used to be as fundamental to our culture and our society as marriage. So I think that's just a very interesting example that probably doesn't get enough attention, and certainly isn't getting enough conversation for the people who are in those dynamics and in those relationships.
Recently, we had on the show Dr. Claudia Golden, who was Harvard's first actually tenured economics professor, and her area is really women in the economy, and particularly the gender wage gap. And what was so fascinating about her research is that the gender wage gap is actually driven primarily in heterosexual couples who have kids. And it's because of the necessity of, kids take a ton of time, big jobs take a ton of time. And so decisions are made at the level of the family about who's going to go out and bring in most of the bacon and who is going to take care of the little ones. And while it has historically been women who have made that choice, or who have decided to do that in the context of relationship, what was fascinating to me and how it links to what you've just said is that so much of this comes down to what's going on at home. Like how are you making decisions together about what this relationship is going to look like? The breadwinner thing is interesting to me. I think there's certainly been this sense historically that it can be emasculating, maybe. Historically, there's this idea if your wife or your female partner is earning more than you, it's emasculating. And sometimes there's sort of scorn. Why would anybody ever feel that way? Can you take us into the brain of a guy? You know what I mean? Like, is it emasculating, Connor? Like, what? I'm so curious about modern men and how they actually feel about it.
Yeah, well, first I'll say something personally, and then I'll kind of get into the social aspects of it. So, I grew up between two family systems. My parents got divorced when I was about 3.5, and they both married other people. And, my mom married my stepfather, and my dad married my stepmom. And what was fascinating is my upbringing. I was raised by my mom and my stepdad for the most part. And they had a more traditional set. My mom worked for sure. She worked for a bank and she still made decent money. But my stepdad out-earned her, not significantly, right? They were both pretty blue collar. But he out-earned her. And that was kind of known, but it really wasn't a big deal. It was just sort of in the background. Nobody ever questioned, but nobody ever talked about it. It wasn't a thing. On the other hand, my dad married my stepmom, who would start a couple years after they got married, would start to out-earn him significantly, and then would go on within, I want to say 5 to 8 years. She went and got a master's degree, and they sort of made a decision as a couple that whoever sort of struck, I don't know if struck gold is the right word, but whoever's career started to advance first, that person would take priority and the other person would sort of prioritize the kids. And so her career started to really hit, to the point where she became the national VP, one of the first female national VPs of a telecommunications company in Canada. And so she was substantially out-earning him. And it was interesting to see the dynamic, because I think it was somewhat foreign territory for that generation. My parents are almost in their 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And so it was a bit of an interesting thing, because I could hear my dad sometimes talking about what that was like, and the flack that he might sometimes get, being called a kept man and those types of things. So there was certainly a type of prejudice or commentary that came along with being a man whose partner was out-earning them. So that is on the personal side. I didn't really have any judgment around it. It was just interesting to notice. It was interesting to notice their dynamic and the challenges that they faced in their relationship. The challenges that my stepmom faced. She traveled extensively. Not being there as a mom, I think, was very tough for her, but I can't really speak to her experience. That's for her to do. But I think one of the things that, when we zoom out socially, becomes challenging is that as our culture has changed and women have become, much higher earners and, are occupying a lot of this territory of being the breadwinner in the household, for a lot of women, their mating selection preferences haven't changed. So what does that mean? It means that if you ask women in general, and there's a good amount of research that's been done on this globally, a pretty substantial amount of research by a gentleman named Dr. David Buss. They have done research globally that has dug into what women are looking for in a male partner in a heterosexual relationship. And, there's primary things like kindness and understanding, but one of the major attributes that is cross-cultural, that is cross-ethnicities, that is cross-religions, is that women still look for men who have resource acquisition potential. AKA, they have the ability to earn. And on average, women, when asked, how important is financial stability to you? How much is, how important is it for a man to earn? Women, will above average say that they prefer a man that earns as much as them, if not more than them. And so what's happening is that there's a bit of a social pressure that men know, right? So there's this contrast in the fact that a lot of women are out earning a lot of men now. And men also know that women are still predominantly looking for a man who either earns as much as them or out earns them. Because resource acquisition for a very long time, and we could kind of get into the evolutionary side of that and the social role of it and the anthropological role that that's played throughout our development as a species. But resource acquisition has always sort of been something that has been important for the heterosexual relationship and has been an identifier that women have looked for, whether it's a man who already has a good amount of resources, right? And so resources are, financial stability. So he's got good finances, his social network that can also be a kind of resource. His physical prowess, his intelligence can be another resource, but the main one is finances. So what a lot of the data shows is that women are either looking for a mate, looking for a man who has the resources now or has the capacity to acquire the resources in the future. And so a lot of guys have a sense of this, right? A lot of men know that it's important for women that they earn decent money. Now, is that every single woman? Of course not, right? I mean, I've heard this all the time on online, comments on my videos and stuff like that, where there's some women that are like, I don't care what he makes. If he wants to be a stay-at-home dad, like that's okay. But there's still an overwhelming amount of women who are looking to date what's called up and to the right. So up in terms of status and to the right in terms of acquisition potential or resources in the moment. And so a lot of guys know that. And so in order to kind of find the best partner, we've been conditioned in some ways to believe that we need to have resources, or we at least need to have the resource potential in the future, because that's what women are looking for in a big way to cue a good mate, right? To cue somebody that's going to be a good either long-term partner or short-term partner. So it's not so much that it's demasculating. That can sometimes enter into the equation for sure. I think that there's still men that are out there that, depending on your religious background, because I think religion plays a big factor in this, in the sense that within most religious structures, the man is still expected to be the provider, whether that's Jewish religion or Christian or Catholic or Muslim or whatever it might be. There's still a pretty orthodox perspective that the man should be the provider in that space. And so generally speaking, you're going to see in those sort of fundamental spaces that the pressure on the man to earn more than the woman is much higher. And so I think that those types of things play a factor in the equation when we talk about this issue, because it's not just sort of one-dimensional in terms of like men across the board or women across the board. There's a lot of factors that start to play into it.
Out of curiosity, in your research, so you talked about how women prefer men who have at the same or higher resource acquisition potential. What have you learned about what women want? What men want in a mate? I'm curious.
Yeah, so I don't have the exact data off the top of my head, but for the most part, men aren't as interested in finances. So, and I'd have to pull the study on this, but there was a few studies that were done to look at how does a woman's financial capacity and her ability to get resources or acquire resources, or how much money she's worth in the current moment, impact a man's perspective on whether she's a viable mate. And for the most part, it rates very, very low. Like, men are not generally looking for partners who have financial stability or, are going to be out earning them in the future. It's just not something that the majority of men are looking for. We might, look for women that are going to be able to contribute for sure. Especially, when you start to dig into it, when kids start entering the equation and buying a house and all those types of things, to maintain a certain lifestyle, there's the expectation that the partner, will certainly want to contribute. but it's not something that men are looking for in terms of a viable partner. For the most part, what a lot of the data is showing is that what men are looking for is, number one is oftentimes language around peace and ease and companionship. Because for the most part, I don't want to phrase this piece. For the most part, commitment is oftentimes in the hands of men, right? So there's a saying that floats around online in different spheres that says, women are the gatekeepers. I guess we could probably find a better word for that, but women are the gatekeepers of sex, and men are the gatekeepers of commitment. And so when you often look at the dynamic in a heterosexual relationship in couples, men are often the ones that are tasked with or responsible for saying, yes, this relationship is going to move forward, and let's get into a relationship. And a lot of confusion happens when a man's not clear about that, and vice versa when it comes to sex. And so what a lot of men are oftentimes looking for is a sense of, is this relationship or is this person going to add ease to my life? And is this relationship and this person going to contribute to my life if I decide to commit to them? And so the commitment is the really big piece, right? So a lot of men will hold off on commitment to try and understand, do we have sexual alignment? Are you willing to be open to me sexually or emotionally? Those are some cues that oftentimes men will look for. And does this improve my life? Maybe isn't the right term, but does it better my life in some capacity, or does it make my life more taxing? And so those are some of the things that
makes so much sense.
Yeah.
That makes so much sense. Like it wasn't until I had sons when I started to see how much they dislike, I could be asking simple questions and it's like I'm interrogating them,
Right.
So I'm like, what is, I know what, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, so the whole peace thing, I've really sort of learned that instinctively, but it's fascinating to me to hear how important it is and how it's not just about sex or how good looking you are. I mean, obviously that's a part of it. We tend to think that that's actually what's most important to men. Culturally, that's sort of the narrative, but it's interesting that it's actually not necessarily just that.
Yeah, 100%. And I do think that there's a subset of men who hyper prioritize beauty and sex, and that is there, within the data, and you can just see that sort of online. But for the most part, there's, like, for an example, there was some research done to see how the distribution of how attractive men find women and the distribution of how attractive women find men. And what was really interesting is that when you look at how attractive men find women, there's just sort of this natural bell curve, right? So you have, sort of the lower end, and then there's this higher population right in the middle where men would rate women, sort of average attraction. And then it sort of tapers off as it gets towards like the 9s and the 10s, right? The higher levels of beauty and attraction. But it's still an even distribution. Whereas when you look at how women view men's attractiveness, it's quite different. It's actually stacked much heavier towards the lower end of the spectrum. So, and you can see this.
Sorry, that's funny.
No, it is true, right? And
so harsh.
So but you can see this in like Tinder data, as an example, right? So Tinder data is very fascinating, and just dating app data in general is very fascinating, right? So you can look at, like, if you take 100 women and 100 men, 95% of those women, so 95 of those women will be going after 5 to 8% of the men. Yeah. And so you have this massively disproportionate amount of women going after 5 or 8 of the men. So 5 or 8 of those men out of the 100 are going to have a very broad subset of women that are vying for their attention and their potential because they meet the criteria, right? And online dating's kind of crappy at best because we're having to make super quick decisions, right? And so what women are looking for is, does he look safe? Does he look engaging? Does he look like he's secure? Does he look like he has his life together? And then there's other pieces, right? Does it look like he's, financially well off, or does well for himself, or has the capacity to do so, some of those other things. And so what has happened, and we can see in the Tinder data, is that, like I said, you've got a huge population of women going after a very small subset of men, leaving a very large amount of men with almost no interaction at all. Like if you look at the bottom 50% of men on Tinder, they get almost no traction at all, like almost none. They'll swipe right thousands of times and get very few sort of replies or swipe rights back on them or
That's
matches.
so
I think
disheartening.
I think it's called
that would,
matches.
yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. It seemed like that one hit for you.
Yeah, well, it did, because it explains why. I believe I saw research that suggests that there is a big proportion of men aged under 30, basically aged 18 to 30, who are single, much bigger than
Can I
historically. Yeah.
So 66% of men between the ages of 18 to 29 are single. 66%, right? So you've got pretty much 2/3 of men are single between 18 and 29. Of that 66%, 50% of them aren't even looking for a relationship. So they've just sort of given up. They're either like, I'm not even going to try, or they've just dedicated themselves to building themselves into a potentially viable mate. And I'll get to that in a second. Of that same age range, 18 to 29, 27%, right? So 1/3 of those men haven't been sexually active in the last year or ever.
Wow.
Uh-huh. So, and for women, we'll just back the train up. For women, only 33% of women in that same age bracket are single. So half, right? And only 13% of the women in the same age bracket haven't been sexually active in the last year or ever. So you have this massive discrepancy where women are on average, not necessarily more sexually active per person, but on average across the data set, more women are being sexually active than young men, and more women are dating than young men. Now, what's the discrepancy for that? This is where the data gets kind of fuzzy and the research gets kind of fuzzy. But some of the guesses, and these are just educated guesses, it's not hard fact, but some of the guesses are the discrepancy sometimes that between men and women saying that they're in a relationship, right? So we've all had that happen, where you think you're in a relationship, you're dating somebody, and the other person's like, "Nah, I'm single." Right? So that can certainly play into it.
Such fun times.
But that's not a huge portion of it. The other part of it is that women in that age bracket are dating older men, and so a lot of these younger women are dating men that are meeting their criteria. Right? They're more established, they're more financially secure, they're more mature. Right? Because we all kind of probably heard the research that girls and women mature faster than young men. Right? A young man's prefrontal cortex isn't even fully formed until he's like 25 or 26, right? So then all the maturation has to happen after that. So I think that's one of the big ones, is that a lot of women are starting to date older men, and that's just showing up in the data more so than it ever has before. And the last piece is that there are these men who are in that very high, sort of like top 5% of men that are over 6 feet tall, that are very financially secure, that are living a certain lifestyle, that are with multiple women. And those women know that, right? They know that there's, maybe they know. Sometimes they probably don't. I probably shouldn't say that all the time. But that
the lived experience would suggest otherwise, Connor.
Lived experience, yes. Yeah. So that's good. Yes. Thanks for catching me on that.
No problem. So
there's this growing portion of men that have realized that if you meet certain criteria, right? Because again, I'll just give you another data point. Like I think on Hinge, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, but the women that showed height preference within their profiles on Hinge, it was 80% of them had their height preference set to over 6 feet tall. So they're looking for a man over 6 feet tall, but only 15% of American men are over 6 feet tall.
Oh my gosh.
So again, and it's not to say that any of these preferences are wrong or bad, or it's not judgment around it, right? It's just this is the data, right? This is what's coming in and creating discrepancies. And so I think that there's some men, just imagine, do you mind sharing how old your boys are?
Yeah, they are 12 and 16.
12 and 6, ooh, 16.
Yeah.
What an age,
right?
man.
What an age.
I bought my first Mustang for $500 at 16. 'Cause in Alberta,
Nice.
in Alberta, Canada, where I grew up, you can get your learner's license at 14. So you start to drive
On
at
a
14.
on a tractor, or just for a regular car?
Regular car.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wild West.
You have to drive with somebody over the age of 18 in the vehicle. And then when you turn 16, you can get your full license and be free. And so I did. But,
amazing.
yeah, so I think, a lot of young men are growing up in an era where they're inundated with narratives around what it means to be a man in the modern day. And a lot of those narratives are very conflicting, like they're getting narratives around how just being a man is dangerous or being a man is toxic, right? I mean, you have like the APA, the American Psychological Association, a couple of years ago put out guidelines for therapists and psychologists to work with men. And in it said traditional masculinity is harmful and dangerous, verbatim.
Wow.
Right? So you have a lot of young men who are growing up in an environment where they're hearing stories, they're hearing beliefs and narratives that to be a man is to be dangerous or to be harmful or to be toxic or some version of that. And that can be very confusing because for young men, it's like, okay, well then how should I operate as I'm entering into adulthood? Once I'm leaving high school and I'm going to college, what is that going to look like? How should I behave? And they're being hit with a lot of messages that are either telling them to be, very vulnerable and very open and those types of things, but they're also being hit with messages from guys like Andrew Tate that are showing them this sort of not hyper masculine, but this hyper wealthy passport bro lifestyle where they're traveling on private jets and they've got the Bugattis and there's women everywhere. And if I can tell you, if you're a 16 to 18-year-old boy and you have a tremendous amount of testosterone coursing through your body and you're getting, I don't know how vulgar I should be on your show, but
it's fine.
You're getting boners on the bus and in the classroom and you're not asking for them, they're just showing up. Like that sounds pretty good. I remember what that was like at that time, and it's a confusing time, but it's also a time where you are starting to feel, the majority of young boys are starting to feel this internal sense of potency, not power necessarily, but a potency. And I think that
is being labeled, unfortunately, to your point, which is broadly being labeled as toxic.
Yes.
And to me, I didn't even know who, and this is not about Andrew Tate, but I didn't know who he was. But he's so influential. And I started reading about, listen, if you have teenage boys as parents, you should be paying attention. Yeah, you got to talk to them. And so I have. And what's interesting is that, if I'm being honest, half of what he says is constructive. Mm-hmm. Half of what he says, and half of what he says is constructive, and you can see that. And half of what he says is absolutely not.
Yeah, it's wildly inflammatory.
Wildly inflammatory, totally dangerous. But where do they go? Where are the role models? And in a narrative where a lot of masculinity is defined as toxic, it's concerning.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you saying that because I think, I've been in enough, I've spoken at United Nations Women. I've spoken at female-only events with 1,000 women in it. And I get asked all the time to speak at these types of events and be on these types of shows, and I love it. I think it's a very interesting discourse to have. One of the challenges that I've bumped up against is sometimes, and this isn't all women, but sometimes there are women who just really don't like men. They've been hurt by men, and they've been betrayed by men, and they carry that hurt and that betrayal into parenting or into the workplace or wherever it might be. And those narratives spill out online. And I remember a buddy of mine, we were having this conversation about, because I have a son, he's 2 years old, and he has a son, he just had a son. And we were having a conversation about what the future might be like for our boys to grow up in. And he sent me a text one day and he said, Google search, would the world be better without men? And I was like, okay, that's sort of weird. Like, sure. And I did, and what came up was hundreds of articles posing the question and going down this pathway of would the world be better without men? So imagine growing up as a young boy in an environment and a culture that is questioning whether or not you should even exist in it. Like, that's heartbreaking for me. I don't know if it is for you, but it's heartbreaking for me to think about your boys, my son, growing up in a culture that's saying you're dangerous, you're toxic, maybe the world would be better without you, just because you were born male. That's sad. And we wouldn't do that for any other gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. We just wouldn't do that, because we know that that's harmful. But so that's a little bit of a side tangent. I think to come back to Andrew Tate, the other thing that I see is that there is a vacancy and a sort of vacuum of really healthy male role models. And there's a vacancy of father energy. So 1 in 4 kids in America are going to grow up without a father present in the household. 1 in 4. Now, the research and the data for young girls shows that it doesn't have as big of an impact. There might be more a heightened level of sexual promiscuity later on in life, whether it's in the high school years or late teens or early 20s. But it's not going to necessarily impact their grades, their education, their career. Whereas for young men, it's quite different. So for young men, they are going to struggle exponentially. So you have something like 85% of kids that run away from home are from fatherless homes. You have 90% of school dropouts from fatherless homes, which school dropouts are predominantly men, right? They're predominantly boys that are dropping out of school. So you start to see that there's this erosion of male presence within a young boy's life. And what's sad is that when you layer on the absence of a father presence, that boy is then going to enter into school where he's going to be confronted with 2% of kindergarten teachers are male, and only 32% of teachers in the school systems in America are male. And that's decreasing year over year. That's actually dropping exponentially year over year. And then he's going to enter into the college system where there's less men teaching. That's dropping. And he's going to enter into the college system where in right now, only 42% of graduates from college are male, and the rest are women. And so that is proportionally inverse to what it was in the 1960s, right? We passed Title IX in the 60s because there wasn't enough women going to continuing education to colleges and universities, and we saw that it was a problem. We did something about it. And so there's this inverse that's starting to happen where a young boy, will go through education, if he goes into college, and have very few male role models around. And then, we could just continue on, right? If he goes to see a therapist or a psychologist, like 29% of therapists and psychologists are male. So there's very few influences that young boys and young men are seeing within our culture of what it can look like to be a good man. And what they see is that whether you're somebody that's, highly educated, and I'm going to say Voldemort's name, Jordan Peterson, whether you're highly educated like Jordan Peterson and have done a tremendous amount of research, and again, I'm not advocating for him, I'm just making him a statement about an example, or you're somebody that is like Andrew Tate, you are attacked. And so all of the real male role models that are held up within our society are ripped down. And this is something that I've done within, when I go and speak at women's events, is I say, who is a male role model that you actually admire and respect? And the challenge is that for a lot of women, there just isn't one. And I don't know why that is necessarily, but I think that needs to change, both on our part as men, that we certainly need to step up and be better role models, both for the future generation of young boys, but also for the women in our lives. And I think that we need to reestablish that masculinity and maleness is not only okay, but it's paramount for our culture, that it provides something meaningful. So thanks for coming to my TED Talk. And
well, with that, I want to bring up mansplaining. So I had a very interesting conversation with my husband about this because I may or may not have accused him of mansplaining to me. But he was like, I was not mansplaining. I was making my point. And what's interesting to me is when you look at the research, now you're going to be better phrased in this than I am, but my sense of the research is that women tend to be extremely relational. When we're in conversation, we're looking at who's going to talk, who did that person have something to say? Let's make space for that. So there's a lot of this happening, and that men are not necessarily that relational. And so sometimes when they have, and also, in fact, and I think I've seen this in your work, that sometimes disagreeableness is actually a constructive characteristic of masculinity. Mm-hmm. And so what my husband was essentially saying is, I was going to take my time to make my point, as in I'm owning my voice, which is what you say people need to do all the time. He really doesn't like mansplaining. He dislikes this as a term. He feels that it's quite demeaning. I'm curious about that because again, what we're saying here is we need these great role models. We don't have them. We also don't really make a ton of space, and it's actually sort of unmasculine for men to be seen to advocate for themselves in some way. It's certainly something that we're much more used to women doing, advocating for ourselves. I'm curious your thoughts on this dynamic, on mansplaining specifically, but on the broader sort of cultural context here around it.
This is great. I went on a podcast called Girls Gotta Eat, and they're like these two comedians. And one of the first questions that they asked was like, why do guys send dick pics? And I was like, oh boy.
It's true, right? That's a good question.
Yeah. We could get into that at some point. That's not a
problem.
Totally. Mansplaining. I get where the term has come from in the sense that I think we went through a period in America where there was this degradation of women in the feminine, and that sometimes men would talk down to women. They would talk down to them, and they would talk to them like they didn't know something. And that's a brutal experience, right? Nobody wants that. But I think that we've taken that and sort of copied and pasted it over top of any kind of behavior that we don't like, or any kind of behavior that we feel offended by, or any kind of behavior that, comes across in a way that we wouldn't communicate. So when we don't like a man's communication, what oftentimes is happening is like, oh, you're mansplaining now. And it's like, well, how would you like me to share my perspective? I think that we've done, I think, a social disservice in trying to dilute men and women down to wholly sane beings. And we've removed any kind of discrepancy, whether it's in our physical forms, our mental and our psychological forms, or even within our communication. I've been working with men for a decade, and I've been speaking with women for a decade. And for the most part, it's often that men and women communicate differently. I mean, it's why there are couples therapists out there that are making very good livings for themselves.
I think you might know some.
I think I might, yeah. I'm married to one of them. Yeah, my wife is a great couples therapist and has done very well for herself. And so, but there are communication differences. And so, if a man's talking down to you as if you don't know what you're talking about, yeah, he's probably coming from a disrespectful place and being inconsiderate, and there's assholes out there. But the portion of men that are genuine assholes or genuine narcissists, and the subset of men that are committing the quote unquote crimes that and crimes is a heavy term, but that are acting out in these ways is a very small portion of men. And you can look at this in the data around things like abuse and violence at home. It's a very small subset of men that are perpetrating these types of things and that are repeat offenders, that are going out and being disrespectful in public and stalking and these types of horrible things. But it's a small subset of men that it oftentimes gets distributed as if it's all men that are acting this way. And so what ends up happening is that there's this, what I've called the call for castration, right? There's sort of this call for castrating men and making them much more submissive and docile and domesticated than they naturally are. Now, I watch my son, and he is a wild child. I mean, I came home last night, and he, I call him undomesticated Chooch. His nickname is Chooch. And so I'm like, you're undomesticated, bro. Like, he will just not listen. He's rambunctious, and he's throwing himself around. And I didn't teach him to do that, right? He's 2 years old. I haven't ingrained that in him. He also is not witnessing me wiling out like a crazy little animal in the house. I'm a very calm, grounded man around the home. And so, I struggle sometimes with these terms, and I'll tell you why, and I'll wrap up, because I feel like you've got some other good questions that I want to get to. When I hear terms like toxic masculinity and mansplaining and manspreading, all these types of terms, one, they wouldn't be socially viable or acceptable if you put women in front of them, period. And two, they are a shame-based way to control the other person's behavior, which will automatically create an outcome that you don't want. And I'll use a psychological principle to sort of explain my point. If you have anxiety, or if you struggle with rage, but maybe I'll just stick with anxiety. If you have anxiety, which a lot of people do, and you try and deal with that anxiety by saying, I hate you, I wish you'd just go away, or I'm going to ignore you, or that's this stupid anxiety again, what the heck's wrong with you? What you're doing in that moment psychologically is creating more tension and animosity towards that part of yourself. And when we do that, we all know what that does. One, it doesn't make us feel better, but two, it actually empowers that anxiousness. So the more that we say, I don't like this anxiousness, I don't want this anxiousness, I wish this would just go away, I hate this part of me, it actually empowers that thing that we're trying to learn to be in relationship with, that we are trying to learn how to be with. And yet this is the approach that we've taken with the behavior of individuals in our society, in our culture, that we don't like, or that we don't agree with, or that we don't understand. And so we create these terms like toxic masculinity, which I think I would argue, has done so much more harm than good.
I think I agree. I think I agree. And I do, because I see what I see in young boys and men is just sort of a frustration and disengagement.
Right.
You don't value me, or and to me, that's very dangerous.
Yeah. Actually.
And that is absolutely not what we want. And I think, one of the things that drew me so much to your work is it's fascinating, but it's also just trying to understand it as a mother to two boys who are trying to make their way in the world. Mm-hmm. I suspect that I'm not alone. I suspect that there's a lot of other women out there, especially moms to boys, who are like, help us, Connor, help us, help them, like, help us create a world. But you know what's so interesting? I can remember speaking with a group of women some time ago, and one of the women was saying this. She was like, I'm seeing this major social change. And, to re-quote Dr. Claudia Golden, the shift in women's contribution to the workforce and women's earning power has been one of the most rapid social shifts in history. It has been remarkably different. And to the point that you made earlier, we really haven't done much as a society to talk about how that really impacts us. We have, assumed this is great, which it is, but it also deeply disrupts family systems and social systems. And it's kind of been like, well, guys, you've been in charge for a long time. Now it's our turn. Deal with it. Mm-hmm. And even as women, so in this conversation that I'm telling you about, the woman who was saying, I'm really starting to feel for men and boys. And she was kind of attacked by other women in the group who were saying, that's just women taking responsibility for everything, being in this role where we have to care for everybody. They should be able to deal with it themselves. Have you heard of it? It was fascinating. It was totally fascinating. I'm curious about, your take on that. Is this, well, it's our turn. Have you experienced this narrative as you have done your work, kind of talking about the call for castration, as you put it?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think on average, the average woman that's out there when I have these conversations is they get it, they agree. They see it in their brothers or their husbands or the boys in their life that are struggling to find direction. They see it maybe in the narratives within the media of, sort of degrading men or male contribution. And so, I face not a ton of pushback because I also am not advocating against women. I'm also not saying we need to go back to some way that we were living in the past. That's not what I'm saying. And I'm never advocating for that. But I am advocating for a true sense of meeting one another and being in relationship. Like every human being wants to belong, pure and simple. That's one of our core primary needs and necessities. And I just think that we're doing a poor job within our culture of creating belonging. And I get where it's coming from, again, from a psychological standpoint, right? There's, repression, women didn't have a lot of choice for a long time, couldn't vote, couldn't be in the workforce, couldn't go to college, couldn't do these types of things that were an integral part of society. And so it's natural that there would be some generational, hate or animosity towards men that would emerge on the other side of that. But I think that we need to have these conversations because a culture and a society that has this kind of intensity around the gender war that's happening, it's very hard for it to survive. Imagine if you just take I like to just take small ecosystems as an example. If you just take a family unit as an example, you have, and just a heterosexual family unit, right? You have a father and a mother and maybe some kids. If that father and mother don't respect one another for the fundamentals of what they bring to the table, whether it's as a man or as a woman, or as a husband or as a wife or, whatever it might be, that family unit, that system's going to erode very quickly because it's just going to disintegrate because there's no real connection. There's no real sense of, I belong here. And when we don't feel like we belong somewhere, we leave. Right? We don't want to be there anymore. And this en masse is what I see happening within our culture with young men. They are exiting. There are 7 million men between the ages of 25 and 55, which is the primary working age, that are jobless and not searching for a job. 7 million men.
Wow.
Yeah, right? So then again, you have the imploding rates of college, right? I think it's by 2030 or earlier, I think it was like 3 to 5 years from now, there will be 2 female college grads for every 1 male college grad. So you have this disproportionate, and that doesn't mean that, to be a man and be successful in the world that you need a graduate degree or you need a bachelor's degree. That you can be wildly successful without it. I mean, I have a bachelor's in music, and then have gone on to build an incredibly successful company and career by learning through apprenticeship and mentorship. So you can have success while being in the trades, but again, another discrepancy is that educated women on average want educated men. And so there's a poll.
It's back to where we started.
Right. So
Yeah.
I think it's something like 70% of women that have a college degree will only date or prefer a man who has a college degree. So these preferences that we want in our culture and our society, right, that women are looking for, are starting to become more and more disparate, so that the dating pool that women are looking for is shrinking. It's increasingly shrinking.
Well, it's that, but it's also what we know about societies where you have men who are sort of working age or young men who are, they're not working. They're potentially not part of a family. When you have men without a lot to do, generally that is not a good thing. It's really, really not a good thing for society generally. I mean, how worried are you?
I don't spend a lot of time worrying. There's this, I don't remember where the quote came from, but it was something along the lines of like, worrying is praying to the devil.
It's a good one.
And so I don't spend a lot of time fretting about it. I think part of the challenge about the territory that we're in as a species is we are evolving more rapidly than we ever have before. We're creating more complex systems than we ever have before. We are progressing faster than we ever have before. I mean, the data that we've just talked about women just en masse entering into college institutions and into the workforce and I mean, that's something that relationships and family systems just haven't even caught up with, right? The modern narrative and conversation hasn't even caught up with the progress that's happened. And so I think, we could, sorry, just to get back to my point, I think one of the main problems that we're facing is that we are immersed in fear on a daily basis, right? The fear of AI, the fear of climate change, the fear of whatever it is. And so I think it's less about being worried for me and more about being informed and grounded to have discourse, to then say, what do we do? How do we want to handle this? What do we want to talk to our sons about? I mean, something like artificial intelligence is going to radically alter our education system in the next 3 to 5 years, so that when my son is 10 and is in grade whatever, I don't even know what the grade that is, 4 or 5, I mean, I can't even comprehend what that's going to look like. I mean, he could theoretically start using ChatGPT-4 tomorrow to learn how to read and to learn science.
100%, yeah.
And to have discourse with this artificial intelligence that could then teach him anything that he needed to know. So I really think it's a time that we're entering into where we actually need to put down the swords. We need to put down the shields, whether it's the fight against men or against women or whatever it is that the individual is fighting for. And we need some continuity. And I'll wrap up by saying this. I interviewed this gentleman named Frans de Waal. And Frans de Waal is one of the single most decorated primatologists ever in existence, right, besides Jane Goodall. So he has spent his entire life studying chimpanzees and bonobos, and we've learned a tremendous amount from his work. But one of the things that I've talked about recently that I've sort of tried to get out there is this misconception on what it means to be quote unquote alpha within our culture and our society, whether you're an alpha female or an alpha male or etc. And what he found in his research is that you can be an alpha, I'll just use male for this because I talk a lot to men. You can be an alpha male and use dominance and aggression as a means of leadership, but the likelihood of you lasting very long is quite low. So when you look at primate cultures, men that use dominance and aggression are eventually taken down by the tribe because they're using violence against the rest of the collective. So the real alpha males in chimpanzee culture and primate culture, right, whether it's chimpanzees or bonobos or whatever, the ones that last the longest are actually the alphas that are able to create social coherence. They're actually able to solve social unrest and disruptions. They're able to temper the natural violent behaviors of some of the younger men, right, specifically within their teenage years. And when I say men, I mean like chimps and bonobos. But it's that type of leadership that I think that we're all being asked to step into, is a more grounded orientation of, rather than going to war and becoming reactive with the thing that I'm offended by or pissed off by or disagree with, how do I create more continuity and more discourse and more cohesion? Because that is the only way through, in my opinion. I think that is the only way through. The more disconnection, the less discourse that we have and the less cohesion we have, the more problematic all of our issues become. And I think I've seen this in the younger generation, that they feel it. The rising rates of anxiety and ADHD and all of these issues that our younger generation is facing, it's because they're growing up around adults who are just fucking dysregulated all the time, right? All of their parents are just in a stress state all the time. And so I think that we need a call towards grounding, towards regulation, towards coherence, to stop this mess of not being able to have discourse and conversation around the issues that matter. And we need that we need that at work, we need that at home, we need that within the political system, because the way that we're going is not great and it's not workable. And I think that we all know that.
Connor Beaton, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This was a blast.